Good morning, welcome back. Another live stream. How to D&D. We're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, fantasy, mounts, animal mounts. But this isn't the mount video that you've seen everybody else do, because I don't really do that. This is a very different take on animal mounts and mounts in Dungeons and Dragons and so forth. So I've kind of collected a lot of stuff. I did a lot of research. And I didn't really do research on fantasy stuff. I actually looked at real animals and how they work. So if that's sort of your thing, you're probably in the right place. So my suggestion to you is get comfortable and we will discuss animal mounts in your game, how they work, whether they will work or not. And I would suggest grabbing some food, some money, get comfortable, get ready. We're going to do this, okay? Hi Jasper, how's it going? And yes, this is going to be a fun time. This was very educational for me and actually completely out of my comfort zone when I was putting this all together. And I'm hoping that you enjoy it. Anyway, let's get started. Drink of water. Hopefully the lurgy doesn't attack me while I'm trying to do this. Here we go. Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Weller and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Well, yes, we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. We're going to talk about specifically Dungeons and Dragons 5e, but I do feel like this can be ported over to other versions of Dungeons and Dragons, even Pathfinder and other fantasy games. So it's not necessarily completely restricted to just 5e. So what is this? This is everyone's guide to mounts in Dungeons and Dragons. Who doesn't like the idea of having a mount? Well, I think the only person who really has concerns about having a mount is usually the dungeon master. Players love the idea. Of course, there are some aspects to it that get complicated, and I thought I would break this down for you, give you as much information as I possibly can, and then we can then open it up to what I am going to expect to be a very different experience. But anyway, shall we get started? First off, everyone's guide to mounts in Dungeons and Dragons 5e. Now, when I say this, what I mean is land mounts. And when I say mounts, I mean animal mounts. I don't mean fantasy creatures. So I'm not talking about fantasy monsters or fantasy creatures. That's something for another day, okay? This is intended to be a guide for everybody regarding mounts. So there's advice here for players playing a character, and there's advice here for dungeon masters who have to run the game in some way. And that is really my focus, is to try to capture as much of that as I can. There are a few different uses for a mount in a Dungeons and Dragons adventure or roleplay game or Pathfinder game, whatever it might be. And the first most obvious one is traveling from one place to another quickly without overexerting your character, which is, I would say, the main purpose, but not the main purpose stated in the player's handbook for 5e actually. The main purpose that is stated in the player's handbook is transporting adventuring gear or supplies like camping equipment, your adventuring gear, of course, your weapons, your armor, your food, and any treasure that you might find along the way. That's actually supposed to be the main purpose of a mount. So it's more of a beast of burden rather than you go for a ride on it. I would say the main focus for players often tends to be the third use of a mount, and that is combat. Now, that's if it is suitably trained. You need to make sure it's trained first. It needs to have armor on it. Otherwise, frankly, it's likely to get killed or flee the battlefield after throwing the rider and maybe trampling them to death. So there's a few things that we need to sort of look at in terms of what animals would be suitable for the combat aspect and what animals are not suitable for that, which ones are good at being a beast of burden, and which ones are good at just being able to transport a rider of some kind. So I've gone through a few different aspects of this, but first, before we do that, there are some key points to note and recommendations that I have for you on animal mounts. And the first one is that animal mounts need to be saddled. Like if you don't have a saddle and a bit and a bridle, particularly when you're riding it, not so much if it's a beast of burden, but particularly if you're going to ride it for any length of time really and have some kind of control over it, you need to have a saddle, a bit and a bridle. Combat requires a military saddle, which is different to your standard saddle. So you can't just chuck any old saddle on there and think that you can control this thing in a battle, because it's unreasonable to think that that's going to be possible. There is actually information in a player's handbook on the military saddle, for those of you who might have missed it. Now, if you go to page 155 through to 157 of the player's handbook, you will find the information is there. Now, animals require training. But they don't just require training, they require breeding to allow a rider any kind of control over them. And that's for travelling. You know, if you want to travel for any kind of decent length of time, then you need to make sure that they are bred for that and they are trained for that. But combat requires much more training, and they need to be trained at a much earlier age than for an animal that is just going to be transporting you from A to B, because of the rigors that are required. And there's another aspect to combat, and that is, and even for just travelling mounts, and that is you need to have the right psychological attitude. Not all animals have the right psychological attitude. My degree is in psychology, okay? So if you don't have an animal that has the right psychological attitude, they won't make a good riding mount for just transporting you, or they won't make, specifically, they won't make a good war mount, because they won't be able to deal with the rigors of dealing with all of this chaos occurring around them. Now, just because a creature is large doesn't make it suitable as a mount. Okay, I know a lot of people think, well, it's large size, she's good, or it's medium size and my character's small, she's all good. Now, the only way you can sort of eliminate this is if you remove the realistic aspects of physiology from Dungeons and Dragons. If you don't care about the physiology of the game in terms of the animals, then you won't care about this, and this is not something to worry about. But if you're looking at the actual physiology of an animal, just being of large size and having a medium-sized humanoid sitting on top of it isn't necessarily going to be the solution, and having a small humanoid sitting on a medium-sized creature doesn't solve the problem either in terms of physiology, because there are some very basic structures that are required in an animal. That means strong legs and joints, that means a strong back, and the right profile, otherwise you just wind up sliding right off. Now, something like barding or armor for an animal mount, another thing to consider is it's 4 times the price compared to the humanoid equivalent. So if you're thinking, okay, I'm sticking plate armor on this thing, you're going to multiply that by 4, and that's the cost of your barding for that animal. That's if it can even wear plate armor. And many times animals can't wear plate armor because it's simply too heavy or too restrictive. The other thing to consider is that barding for an animal mount weighs twice as much, so it's quite heavy. And some of the heavier armors and medium-sized armors really will weight something down. And an animal, you might find, many animals make ill-suited combat mounts. Their purpose is not for combat, but they have other uses that are pretty good. Now, you'll find the information regarding barding on pages 157 through to 155 to 157. And then there's another section. This is where all the armor is situated. This is on page 145 of the Player's Handbook for 5e. You'll find all the information you need for figuring all that out at your table when you're dealing with barding for your animals. Now, the cost of some domesticated animals and how much they can carry will partly help determine what animals can be used as a mount. But it's not exclusive. It's not like that's the only factor you need to consider. Okay? It's just part of the factor you consider. And what that does, those numbers that they provide on page 157 of the Player's Handbook for 5e, that's for a beast of burden. It doesn't necessarily mean that the animal is set up and designed to be ridden. That is just a guideline for a beast of burden, okay? And There is no definitive rule around this. It's not like for you players that you can say, well, this is how it works, da 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 da. Well, actually, a lot of this has been left up for the Dungeon Master to decide. So you're going to have to do some negotiation with them. Now, I would also like to point out that if every player insists on having a combat-trained mount in the party, a Dungeon Master will more than likely say no. And for good reason, because it does generate extra work and it is more difficult to actually run anything when there are 5 player characters and they all have combat mounts, which now means you now have a party of essentially 10 characters. That's a very different request from a Dungeon Master than just 5. So if your Dungeon Master says no, there's a good reason. And you'll understand when you Dungeon Master yourself and feel the impact of what it's like. I've been there, I've done that. I have had a party of 7 players all riding combat dragons. I know how difficult it is. I'm not talking out of my arse here. Right, let's get to the interesting bit. Here are some real animal mounts that travel on land, and I've given you some pros and some cons. Now, when I say animal mounts, not completely. Some of these really aren't mounts, but they are often animals that are considered possible mounts in a Dungeons and Dragons game or a fantasy game, and people really want them, and therefore they are highly motivated to include them in their game. But there are some significant problems with them. And so I'm going to go through each one step by step. I have about 17 different animals that I have selected, some of which you will be surprised by, and some you won't be surprised by at all, frankly. Okay, so the first one is easy peasies. It's the riding horse. This is an excellent mount that moves quickly. It can travel long distances with a rider and gear, but it's not suitable for combat. It's not a battle horse. And it will, if you take a riding horse into battle, the chances are it is going to flee or throw the rider. So what you need to remember is if you're going to take them into a position where they are going to have to consider battle, then you'll need to start thinking, okay, that military saddle is going to be important, but there's only so much you can do with a riding horse. They are really only designed to get you from point A to point B. Now, it doesn't spell that out in the player's handbook for 5e under the mount and unmount, the mounted section. But I think what you need to understand is when you look at that, you've got to think, okay, that mount is set up, and we're about to talk about it, set up to be a specific type of mount. So there's a lot of leeway, frankly, I think, for a Dungeon Master and players to negotiate with this. Okay, the second one, this is one that you probably were thinking is the one you go for, and I think this is probably the most sensible one to select. And that is the war horse is suitable for battle and transportation because it is trained for the violence of combat. It is strong enough to bear a rider and wear armor. Okay? Not all horses are strong enough or equipped or capable of wearing armor. There are specific breeds that you need to select, and so therefore a war horse is not just like a better trained riding horse. No, it's going to have heavier bones, it's going to be stronger and more muscular, and it's going to be capable of dealing with the rigors of battle. There are specific horses for that. They are superior in every way to all types of mounts as far as I'm concerned, and you'll find them on page 340 of the Monster Manual. You'll find the riding horse on page 336 of the Monster Manual for those of you who want to sort of look it up. The next one, which I think is probably overlooked by many people, but I certainly think you should consider it, and that is the Camel. It is perfect for traveling in desert environments quickly. It is sure-footed in difficult terrain, so if it's irregular terrain, it can deal with that. It's got relatively strong joints. Surprisingly, it doesn't look like it, but it does. It's indifferent to the extreme heat of a desert. It can go for days without water, and it's capable of carrying multiple riders. Not all of them, but many. There are types of camels that can carry more than one rider at a time, which is awesome. They can also carry much more equipment than a horse. And that makes a big difference, particularly when you are trying to get a lot of stuff from one place to another, such as empty out the treasure hoard from a dragon's lair. They will also eat many different types of desert plants, but they can be prone to really bad temper tantrums. Like their demeanor isn't great always. You really need to have a good relationship with a camel for it to work. And then there'll be some bad days with the camel, as frankly, that's just how camels are. And they can't wear armor. You can't put armor on a camel. Now, the reason being is the heat that they are exposed to is so great. The only thing you could really put over them is cloth. You may get away with some light leather, but even leather, laying leather over them to try to protect their body to a certain degree is going to have minimal protection, really, and it's more likely to heat up the animal. And then what happens with a camel when it heats up and it gets too hot and it's overheating is it just stops and it just lies down. And unless you get rid of the stuff on it, it just sits there, and that's it. And now, if you want more information on the camel, then you will find the camel is on page 320 of the Monster Manual. The next one is surprisingly, and I know you won't find a stat block for this one, but I thought I would mention it anyway because it tickled my fancy. This is a full-grown llama. It can be ridden by a small humanoid, children. Usually the weight for a llama is stipulated at a maximum of about 50 pounds, which isn't very much, which means you're dealing with a child. If you've got a character that's wearing armor, forget it, it's not going to work. They need to be very, very light. So you need to put a lot of your gear onto another beast of burden rather than carry it on you on that mount, because they can only deal with so much, a llama. They could carry a small humanoid for transportation purposes. They also have to be the correct breed. Not all llama grow big enough to be able to do this. They can move equipment over mountainous terrains and also people potentially, but they are very slow and they can cover about half the distance of a horse before they need to rest. So they're not as efficient as a horse, but considering that a horse may wind up going lame when you're trying to travel over mountainous terrain, a llama might actually be a better option. The interesting thing about the llama is it makes an excellent guard for livestock, particularly if you only have one. What they do is they sort of attach themselves to the herd and they act as a guard against predators. I didn't realize this, what this means is potentially you could wind up using a llama as a guard for your camp when you are camping up for the night, and they're probably likely to be aware of predators well before you are. So another bonus for the llama. Now, I don't know what stat block you're going to use for that. You decide. Figure it out. It's a llama. Okay. Next. Elephants. Elephants aren't as fast as a horse, but they do carry heavy loads. They can carry more than one passenger. And an elephant is very intimidating to the enemy. With their size, they have the trunk blast. They make a lot of noise when they want to. They have that trampling capacity, like many large animals do. But they're also incredibly unpredictable. And they can also be easily panicked by fire. So if your enemy is aware that elephants don't like fire, you start waving fire at them, then they are probably going to panic, flee, and throw you and then run off in the wrong direction. So that's a bit of a problem. I believe that once people figured out that elephants were afraid of fire, then the horrible practice of setting pigs on fire and running them into the elephants to make them flee was a way of decimating your enemy without having to do anything, because the elephants turned around and then crushed all the troops on their side. So fire's not a good thing when you're dealing with elephants. And if you have a lit torch, they may not be very fond of that at all. So try to use the light cantrip. Elephants require specialized training from an early age if you're going to deal with them with war. Now, they're still going to need some sort of training to transport you or goods or equipment, but they certainly need specialized training. They were used for war quite efficiently and effectively in history. They can wear leather armor, and they can wear types of braided armor, which is basically leather armor with metal strips going across it to help reinforce the armor and make it a bit harder to get through. But they can't, they're incapable of wearing something like metal plate armor. You can't put metal armor on them. It would be ridiculous, because that metal will absorb the heat from the sun, and if they absorb the heat from the sun, it will heat up the animal. And large animals with really big body sizes, they have trouble regulating their temperature. And an elephant is no different. This is why a lot of elephants hang out in a hot day at the water hole, covering themselves in mud and water to keep cool. Otherwise, they just get too hot. That's just how it works. Now, I guess the other thing to sort of stipulate when it comes to an elephant is, I think you'll find that you'll need to classify putting a saddle for an elephant on there as a specialized saddle. There's also a specialized saddle as well in the player's handbook. And if you want information on the elephant, you'll find that on page 322 of the Monster Manual. The next one, a little odd, but we'll go here. The buffalo. I'm also going to include the yak, because kind of like a yak is kind of like a buffalo, but not exactly. And if you don't know what I mean by buffalo, I also mean like water buffalo or bison. Probably the easiest way to say is buffalo. They can be ridden very slowly. They don't go very fast. I think your top speed for a bison or a buffalo is probably going to be about 25 to 30 miles an hour. And that's going pretty fast, like they're rocking it. That's about as quick as they're going to go. They can carry loads, and pretty heavy loads actually, and they can haul gear over a range of different terrain. Although they work best on flat, standish terrain, such as, and for the buffalo in particular, grasslands and hills is fine for them. The yak can actually deal with, the right type of yak can actually deal with more extreme terrain and more mountainous or hilly or rough terrain, which is awesome. But they are unpredictable. The thing with a buffalo or a yak that I've discovered is they're very unpredictable. They have a temperamental disposition. What can I say? A delicate disposition. So buffalo, yaks, and even oxen have not been successfully employed as war mounts or in combat due to that delicate personality, that delicate psychology that the animal has. They are more likely, if you take these things into battle, to throw the rider off, trample them to death, or spear them with their horns, because almost all of them do, unless of course when you get thrown off you wind up going forward and into the horns the first time round, rather than landing on the ground before they then hit you with their horns on the ground. So they're more likely to kill you, okay, if you take them into combat or a conflict rather than killing your enemy. So it's probably not a great idea to use them as a war mount. The next one is the giant goat. Just isn't physically capable of supporting a rider. They have a very weak bone structure. They have fragile legs and spine, so it's impractical. You will find this on page 325 of the Monster Manual, the giant elk. I know a lot of people, is it the giant elk? Yes, the giant elk, 325. Giant elk, not a great choice. Now, falling into the same sort of bracket as this animal is actually the giant goat. They just aren't physically built to support a rider, and they don't have the right, in particular, unlike the giant elk, which is probably a little bit more calmer, the goat just doesn't have the psychological attitude to accept a rider on it. Goats are very, very difficult to deal with. And so therefore, trying to get them to go where you want to, the way you want them to go, even if it's very, very large, is probably not going to work. And they simply just don't get big enough. Even if you have a giant goat, right? If you think about a small goat, you have a larger goats, even if you put a small humanoid on it, it's probably not going to work, and it won't like you very much. Do you know what a goat's like? Seriously, they're not fun to be around. 326, page 326 of the Monster Manual. That's where you'll find the giant goat if you decide to use that. But we've not finished. There's still more. Because I knew you were going to ask me about more stuff, so I thought I'd make sure I was prepared, and I am. The next one, the rhinoceros. Okay, rhinoceros are physically capable of bearing a rider. They are. They have a strong body. They are stout. They've got very strong legs and joints. They have a strong spine. They can support a lot of weight. So they can bear a rider. It would be a very uncomfortable ride on a rhino if you were to start sitting on a rhino and trying to go for a ride. But they can't wear armor because they are prone to overheating, just like an elephant, but much worse. For some reason, rhinoceros have more trouble regulating their body temperature than other larger animals in sort of desert terrain or in tropical or in hotter terrain, hotter environments. So they really struggle, and you can't really take a rhinoceros into a colder environment because their body slows down too much. This seems to be the case with elephants as they become more lethargic. So if you take them out of the normal environment they're used to living in, they can't cope. But they can't also deal with extreme heat as well. So it's like a catch-22. There's a nice middle ground for these animals. Unfortunately, even though a rhinoceros is capable of bearing a rider, strong enough to do so, the rhinoceros is not fond of anything being on their back or being directed anywhere that it doesn't really want to go. If it hasn't decided to go there, it generally doesn't want to go there. And the most likely outcome, even if you could train a rhinoceros, is at some point it's going to throw you off, trample you, or just hit you with its horn, and that'll be the end of you. So I know it's super popular. So it doesn't even make a good tram. You can't be transported really on this thing. It's really going to be no good as in combat because it can't wear armor because it's prone to overheating. It seems like a really good idea until you start looking at the animal and sort of how it works. Some animals are physically capable, but just psychologically it's impractical. They just can't get with it. Okay, and that's why people don't ride around on rhinoceroses, not unless it's for a very short period of time before they wind up on the ground, and part of the ground probably. So you'll find the rhinoceros on page 336 of the Monster Manual if you're wanting to use a rhinoceros. The lion. There's a big problem with big cats. They've always struggled with this, and it's like the thing we want to do in fantasy games is like, let's ride a big cat. But lions have an undulating spine. Now, an undulating spine means it can twist. It also means it has very limited weight-bearing strength. So the spine of a big cat or a lion is not very good. It is not designed to be ridden, which means it can't really be an effective form of transport. It can't wear armor. You can't stick armor on a lion. It's just not going to work. It is more likely to tear the armor off and get frustrated. So it's impractical as a war mount or any kind of mount whatsoever, frankly. Now, for those of you who said, well, I've seen people ride a lion, it's for a very short period of time, and they don't really stand high enough off the ground to be able to do it anyway. So yes, lions don't really like to be ridden. Frankly, you're much more likely to wind up being lunch. So I wouldn't put that down as my top pick in terms of a mount. You'll find the lion on page 331 of the Monster Manual. Now, tigers have the same issues as a lion. You'll find them on page 339 of the Monster Manual. The saber-toothed tiger actually has the same problems as all big cats. The only difference is that the saber-toothed tiger is slightly bigger than the others that I've just described. And you can find that on page 336 of the Monster Manual as well. So big cat's really not an option practically. Unfortunately, for those of you who are wanting, I want to ride my pussycat. It's not really a realistic thing. The next one that comes up that I see people talk about, and that is the bears. So let's talk about the brown bear. Again, actually impractical as a mount for transport or even for battle because they lack the spinal strength for carrying a rider and armor. Even if it was just a rider, it wouldn't matter. But the other aspect to them is because of their sheer bulk and the amount of food they need to eat to move that bulk around, they just don't have the physical stamina for long distances. So traveling a long distance just doesn't work for them. So you can't really ride them. There's another aspect to them, and that is even if you train a bear from an early age, they are prone to instinctive behavior. And that instinctive behavior is, even with a well-trained bear, and this comes up from time to time, and will probably come up particularly if you're around them a lot, and particularly if you're riding on them, which will be the last thing they really like to have happen, is they are prone to they will attack things made out of meat, okay? If you're made out of meat, and you probably are, your lunch, okay? They attack things made out of meat and they eat it. That's just how bears are. So not a great choice. The polar bear, the next, the brown bear you'll find on page 319 of the Monster Manual. The polar bear is even more entertaining, frankly. Again, same issues as any bear, but much worse. Much worse. A polar bear, because of the natural environment that they live in, which is like cold environments where there's very little food, and food is really scarce, is the chance of being eaten by your polar bear mount is much greater, or it attacking somebody and eating them because it's hungry, because they will burn through even more energy because of the cold. You'll find your polar bear on page 334 of the Monster Manual, for those of you who want that. There are 3 more on my list that come up. And I don't know what it is. I looked at so much research on this, and I had to come to the conclusion because traditionally in Dungeons & Dragons, we've had riding horses. Yes, but we've also had riding dogs, like you can ride a dog. But it's probably the most ridiculous thing under the sun. And let me explain. I looked. The large Mastiff dog is not suitable at all as a mount because it's got weak joints. It's actually got a very lazy work ethic, so it doesn't really like to do a lot. It likes to just sort of lay around. It is prone to health conditions, so they get sick very easily and develop other physical ailments. And it just doesn't have the stamina for a long distance, even if you could get a small humanoid on them in the first place with a saddle. So I actually feel like, look, I know people say, yeah, but I've seen my kids riding a dog. No, they tried to ride the dog for a small period of time before the dog got sick and tired of it. And dogs are pretty accommodating to children. And let's say, okay, children equivalent to gnome or halfling. These creatures, they're not capable of doing that. Their bodies are not built for that sort of thing. They are built for hunting. Okay, dogs hunt. Canine. Okay, it's a carnivore. It's a carnivore. It's not designed for that. So you can find the Mastiff on page 332 of the Monster Manual. There are 2 more that fall into the sort of the dog canine category, and that is the dire wolf. Has the same problems as all canines, but they are extremely aggressive. And the chances are that you trying to train one of these things, you couldn't. How are you supposed to breed a dire wolf that doesn't want to just rip you to pieces? Okay, you may be able to make friends with it, but you're not going to be riding it, and they simply don't get big enough. Even the prehistoric dire wolf didn't get that big, right? So, but you'll find them on page 321 of the Monster Manual. And lastly, the giant hyena. Again, has the same problems as all wild dogs, even though it's kind of in a slightly larger size category than some of the other dogs or dog-like canine creatures that I've talked about. The problem is that it's a wild dog and it just doesn't have the bone structure. Even the prehistoric version of the older hyena that's now extinct wouldn't have been able to bear a rider. Even a small humanoid, it just wouldn't be able to do it. And you'll find that on page 326 of the Monster Manual. So I've kind of gone through and just given you a rundown of all of the different creatures and sort of which ones would work best, which ones won't work so well. It should be obvious by now that the ones that I first talked about are the ones you want to go with. So the riding horse is good, the war horse is great, the camel is an excellent choice, the llama you can kind of get away with a little bit, but it won't be for a medium-sized humanoid. Your elephant is excellent. Your buffalo and your yak aren't too bad either. And then after that, everything else is just not really going to work. Now, for those of you who are wondering, what the heck am I doing here? Look, I will talk about flying mounts. It's more suitable, flying mounts are more suitable for much higher levels of play, and it's a topic for another video. Whereas the mounts that I'm talking about right now can really be used from level 1 through to level 20. Like, you could use them at any point. Now, I know you're going to say, oh, you can't use them at level 20, they'll just die. That's what happens. That's what happens. Like, when you go into battle, you have to take more horses than riders because horses die in battles. Now, the actual numbers historically are actually very hard to find. So I couldn't actually give you any information around that. And I actually asked a historian to find me some stuff, and they couldn't find very much. So we can't sort of pinpoint, but my understanding is for every rider, they would often be taking about 10 mounts. So that's 10 horses to every rider. Of course, that doesn't mean that every rider is going to survive every engagement, but that's sort of what the ratio was. And I imagine that's also to deal with being tired, because you can't ride the same horse indefinitely, particularly if you're marching hard. Something like fantastic or exotic fantasy mounts is yet again a topic for another video, and I will do them in the future, just not today. And I think that covers everything that you really need to know about mounts in your game of Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or anything else that you might be playing right now. And I hope this was useful to you, and if it was, fantastic. I would very much like to know in the comment section. Let me know how you are using mounts in your game, and has this changed the way that you see them? What is your experience? What are your thoughts? And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s. Okay, I'm not gone. I am just transitioning over. I'm actually trying to figure out what have I done here. Transition. Okay. Transition, something like that. Okay, we're back. Let's answer some questions. Let's do some Q&A. Let's have a little discussion. I told you when I was doing this that this isn't the kind of mount video that you're used to. Okay, for those of you who are expecting something very different, you don't have to agree with everything that I say, but hey. Oh, and yes, mules and donkeys are actually very good beasts of burden, and you can ride them, as Mr. Welsh has just pointed out. How's it going, Glenn? Nice to see you. Hopefully you haven't had to work too hard. Let's have a quick look at the poll before I have to go through the chat. So 22 people voted, and we've got here, do you want animal mounts in your Dungeons & Dragons game? And we have 86 people who've said yes. Yay! I'm glad to hear it. There's a way of doing it. They don't have to be for combat, because not all of them are really suitable for that. It's only some. And then there's 5% have said no, which I actually totally understand. I know what it's like. I've been there. I've had the worst case scenario. 7 players, all riding combat dragons. Like, it doesn't get much worse than that. Unless, of course, you had 10 players all riding combat dragons. That would be like 20 characters in the same campaign at the same time. I've done, you know what, I've told you what I've done. Undecided is 4%. Oh, the numbers are changing a little bit here as I watch. The 5% turn to a 4%. And already have them in my game. Only 4%. 4% of people are using animal mounts in their game. Like, I hope that this kind of highlights that you can do it, people. It can happen. And you'll be fine. It can be done. Yes, Jasper, you do live. Halfling Paladins. I'm not saying you can't be a halfling and be a paladin, but it's probably not such a great idea to be riding on something that is as small as the picture had indicated, because it probably won't work very well. Remember, dogs, not really a mount, even though some people will insist that they are. Okay, Fred Hubber, how's it going, Fred? So you've always allowed mounts. Yeah, I don't expect all DMs to do this. I am just trying to open them up to the possibility of doing it and giving them some guidance around this, because I know people do ask questions and are a little bit unsure what to do. Yeah, keeping them out of combat so they won't die is a very sensible thing to do. Yeah, that's the thing, is in combat a mount of any kind does become a valid target, which is why you need to put armor on them. But also, too, they're not superheroes, remember? And I know a lot of people will say, look, well, you should be making sure your mounts level up with your player characters. No, actually, no. That's not the case. The idea is not that one player plays two characters. If that's going to be happening, then you just say, okay, play two characters, rather than them playing a character and having an animal mount that's going to be engaging in battle. Let's get to the real crux. That's really what they wanted in the first place, okay? And so if that seems unreasonable, then it doesn't happen. And I don't think that anybody should have to apologise for that, frankly. I think it's quite clear that animals are something that are going to wind up dying, and you need to be aware of that if you take them into battle. Now, there are situations. I will retell a story where my group were travelling on many roads. We were playing the Red Hand of Doom, and we got ambushed by hobgoblins multiple times, and they had spellcasters. And the Dungeon Master would, of course, use the spellcaster and cast Fireball. And we would either fail or save the saving throw for the Fireball. We would usually live and engage in the battle, and all of our horses, didn't matter whether they rolled a successful saving throw or not, had so few hit points the Fireball killed them, all of them, every single time. So every town we went to, we had to go and buy new horses if we wanted to have horses. Eventually, we realised this wasn't going to work, and therefore we stopped buying horses. So there are times where, maybe mounts don't work quite so well in a campaign, even when you do try to keep them out of combat, because the combat comes to you, and you just haven't had time to, come on, horsey, go hide in the bushes, well away from us. It does happen. It's happened to me many, many times. So it's not necessarily the only solution to this problem. It's like, keep them out of combat and they'll be fine. What do you got here, Fred? Well, yes. A horse being cut out from underneath you is a bad deal, or being tossed. Yes, you can use dex saving throws for falling damage and all that sort of thing. I mean, look, the rules are already there. It's pretty clear. I mean, I think, if anything, I know a lot of people don't like the mounted combat rules in Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but they're far simpler and easier to implement than they have ever been in any game that I remember playing in terms of Dungeons & Dragons. Well, at least back till 3.5. I don't know, and I don't remember what it was like in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, and I'm not aware of the earlier games. So yeah, I can't weigh in on that. But as far as I'm concerned, I think so far they're not too bad. They seem reasonable. Okay, Overboard. Hello, Joe. How's it going? Been waiting for this one for a long time. Yes, Joe, I finally did it. Do you know I have a folder on my computer that says exotic mounts, and it's been sitting there for more than 4 years. So I had wanted to talk about the topic many, many times, and I didn't really know how to go about doing it. And then one day I had this epiphany, and this epiphany turned into this video, but I can assure you I cut a lot out. I realized I was going in the wrong direction, and I realized that the video that I wanted to make and the discussion I wanted to have was actually about what are, you know, real animals that you could use as a mount in your Dungeons and Dragons game if you wanted to have that more realistic feel rather than fantasy creatures. But also, what mounts can you use from like level 1 through to level 20? Provided you have the money and the resources and you're buying them from the right place and they're trained, like, is there an issue? Now, here's something that I had a discussion with not so long ago. Before I venture on, I see Mr. Welsh, I see Glenn, I see your comment, I will get there. Now, I had a discussion with some people not so long ago, one friend and a subscriber, and we were talking about the fact that animal handling, it's assumed kind of that you can't just ride a horse without having animal handling. And, you know, I think that if you go to wizard school or bard school, or, you know, you're living in the medieval times or a fantasy medieval world or something like that, and you're a cleric or a fighter, you learn to ride a horse. Like, everybody should be knowing how to ride a horse. Like, that would be unusual. I mean, even a farmhand, you know, somebody who isn't an adventurer would know how to ride a horse. It's the main form of transport in this world. Like, you know, horses would be the way to go, right? Unless if you've got a very customized homebrew world. So if you're using sort of your standard medieval concept, then there's going to be a standard animal that everybody is using all the time, and pretty much everybody knows how to ride one. Do you know what I mean? Okay, let's move on. Mr. Welsh. Really, if you aren't playing with a gnomish pygmy, war rhinos, are you even playing Dungeons and Dragons? Yes, I suppose yes. If you're not playing with a gnome sitting on a war rhino, is it Dungeons and Dragons? There's got to be something wrong. Look, that's a video for another topic. This is actually a very different topic. Like I said, I tried to bring some realism to the topic today, rather than, I don't usually feel too concerned about bringing realism into a fantasy roleplay game. It seems a bit ridiculous, but today I decided I would do that. Yeah. How's it going, Scott? Hello. You're going to make a gnomish army with pygmy war rhinos? Really? Really? Hi, Samuel. What did you think of this one, Samuel? Samuel von Brewster. Now, I'm pretty sure Samuel is a patron on Patreon. For those of you who don't know, on Patreon you get all of my notes for all the stuff that I do in my videos and my live streams, and now everything that I'm doing on Lighthall. Everything that I do on Lighthall is going there as well. So all the classes that I teach there are finding their way there in some way, form. Okay? Instead of the whole party of combat dragons, what about a whole party of war horses? Well, even that's also a bit of a hassle. You think about it, if you as a dungeon master can deal with the impact of having every person with a war horse, I mean, just depending on the size of your group, that's actually a lot of extra work. It's a discussion that you need to have with them. And I'm not saying you need to have a discussion at session 0. Like, there needs to be discussion at some point. It doesn't necessarily need to be in session 0. But you need to sort of like, look, you know, this is actually way beyond my ability to manage. And it's actually a lot of extra paperwork and a lot of extra real estate that a dungeon master has to deal with. So Samuel, I do totally understand that when people like say, I mean, I understand you can have mounts in the game, but I don't want to do it because I've already got enough to do. It's a totally reasonable and valid argument. And I know because I've been there. So I would imagine that a whole party of, look, War horses are much easier to deal with than a whole lot of flying dragons, I can assure you. What do you got here, Fred? A party of awakened war horses, really? You're funny. Hello, Orion. Camels are a real life glitch. Do you know? I'm not unhappy with the fact that camels are actually a real possibility in the game. Like they make so much sense, and I am glad that people have asked me about camels recently, and I'm like, yeah, absolutely, in the right environment. But you do not want to take a camel into an environment that is too cold, because again, then they don't like that environment very much. There's a reason why you find camels in certain places, and there are different types of camelin beasts of burden, or beasts. Full stop. Dead Man Fred TV, how's it going? Kelly Preston, hello there. How you doing? Okay, Fred, what have you got to say about the buffalo? You're going to educate us? They do go slowly. Now, let's just remember that not all buffalo come from America, okay? So I know where you're coming with this, but the American buffalo can keep up with a horse for a short distance. It's not the same thing, a short distance. So look, let's get real. A full-grown American buffalo is not the same animal that a lot of other buffalo around the world are. So it's a very specific buffalo. Yes, they may be able to keep up with a slow horse for a short period of time, but it's not really the same thing. No, look, I wouldn't want to be on I wouldn't even say a target. I've seen what happens to a rider when the buffalo starts picking up speed. It's actually, I mean, it'd be very easy for them to decide to stop abruptly, and the rider goes whoof over the front into the horns. and it's not like the buffalo's just going to stop on a dime. Like you get squished. Feral halflings riding raptors. Look, I know somebody's going to ask me about start talking about dinosaurs. The riding dinosaurs video, that's in the future. That's not today. We'll do that some other time. Okay, we'll come to dinosaurs some other day. That needs its own topic, like specialized for that area. Like that's, and let's get real. Like dinosaurs, they're dead, right? So now we're talking about conjecture here, and I tried to use reality today, or some reality, I guess. Yeah, the dragon owls were pretty cool. Well, yeah, again, a fantasy creature, but we'll get to fantasy creatures in the future. Not today, though. Kelly, look, how about a huge spider as a mount? So I looked up spiders. Spiders can carry, or are about, so they can lift the weight of 170 times their weight. So whatever the weight of the spider is, they can lift 170 times that. So that carrying or bearing a rider is not a problem. Carrying a large weight is probably not a problem. They're very, very strong. The problem, I think, is that spiders don't really move a lot. They're very stationary creatures. It's not like you're going to find a spider that's going to travel long distances. They're not. What they have to, the way that they feed requires them to be sort of static and set up a web, usually. There are spiders who just don't hunt that way, that don't have a web, obviously. This is a fantasy creature. It's, yeah, again, a discussion to have with the giant spider mounts, discussion with your dungeon master. I'll talk about giant spiders in another video some other day. So, yeah, but they're certainly capable of bearing a heavy load and a rider. But how would you put a mount on them? And I also feel like there's a high probability that they're going to wind up trying to eat something that you don't want them to eat, including yourself, unless of course they've got the right demeanor. You've got a special type of bond with your spider, and it doesn't wind up sucking your blood in the middle of the night. A steeder, I don't know what a steeder is. Where are we going with that, Jasper? I don't know. Yeah, there is a tradition of drow riding giant spiders in Dungeons and Dragons for sure. 3.5 had the dire boar. Now, I didn't go near the dire boar because, as a paladin mount, now the reason I didn't go near the boar is I found that when I looked up people riding pigs and boar and other larger piggy creatures, it became pretty apparent that it was not a great idea. Highly unsuccessful. Even more difficult than staying on a dog, frankly. And yeah. It sounds like a joke, but you can actually read the stats and found out that it could tow a galley out of the ocean. Yeah. Okay. All right. A dire boar. That's a fantasy creature, obviously. A real large boar, a real wild pig, it's not capable of doing that. Not capable. Kelly, what do you got here? Mr. Welsh. Any of the course, if you're playing a fairy through what was it? Chosen Mount has always been the corgi. Look, so one of the things, I mean, it should be obvious, is the ligger for the win. Orion, somebody did mention the ligger, which is like a cross between a tiger and a lion. Much to my surprise, I was not aware of it, but you couldn't ride that either. Yeah, I mean, you look at fantasy and really you're dealing with, or circus events, it's a little tiny light monkey sitting on any of these other creatures that I've mentioned. You can't really, they don't have the physical physique for being a mount. It's not really something that humanoids can usually sit on because they're just not built for it. Samuel, I'm just going to have a drink of water. I'm keep going. I've got to make sure I don't stay too long, but I will answer as many of these questions as I can. I'll be as quick as I can. Okay, since there are people here and are obviously interested, so we should talk about it for sure. This is also your opportunity to start throwing out, like, if Fred talks about mounts again, what sort of mounts do we want to talk about? Don't say dragons. I've already done dragons. I've already done a video on dragon riders. Like, it's already there, okay? So if you haven't found it, just go grab it and go and watch it. Now, where was I? I was up to Big Cat, Samuel. How do I explain Battle Cat from He-Man? That's not a real cat. That's a fantasy cat. That's right. Fantasy cat. I was talking about real lions, tigers, and animals. And the saber-toothed tiger did exist at one point. Still not big enough to support a rider. And certainly, even a sheer size, that the spine's not strong enough to support it. It's just the wrong type of body. Mr. Welsh. To what? Shetland Ponies, right? Well, look, you can. Somebody who's very, very small and light could ride a Shetland Pony, I guess. But even a Shetland Pony, I mean, why would you bother? Why would you bother? What about a bull? I think you're talking about cows and bulls now, aren't you? You can probably, the problem I think is you'd find it better to be riding the female cow rather than a bull. It's not that the bull isn't physically capable of supporting a rider, Jasper. It's just their psychology, the way the chemistry in their mind is not that great. So you would really have to sort of, you'd probably have to make sure you remove the horns, because little suckers are likely to take those into you, given the opportunity. And bulls are very territorial, I would say that buffalo and bison are, and they're larger often than a bull. Certainly the American version. They are probably more sedate than a bull, as in a cow bull. Those things are just nuts. Okay, what do you got here, Fred? Yeah, cats do hate having things on their back. Yeah, That's one of the things that you're right, Fred, is that cats, as soon as you try to sit on them, and they don't like to be ridden for very long, and the other aspect is that they just refuse to move. And animals that don't like being ridden, that's what they do. If they don't try to eat you or kick you off or knock you off, they'll just lie down and just refuse to move. Worked for Mongo. Yeah, Mongo was on a bull, but I understand that bull was heavily sedated, like really, really, because you can't really ride a bull. There's a reason why there is rodeos. Bull bull riding is a thing, right? But you don't stay on there for very long. What's this, Pale Rider? Way back, I said I have a character that rode a large polar bear, inspired from a booze advertisement. Yeah, that would have been heavily airbrushed, I'm sure. Orion. Halfling druid, yeah. Now, Pale Rider, were-fox riding a human barbarian. Now, that makes much more sense. I think that a were-fox or a fox could probably ride a human barbarian. Yep, I think that's reasonable. Turn it round. The dog can ride the human instead. You just need a small enough one and you're all good. Mules are actually very cheap and actually a very good idea. A beast of burden, and they can actually support a rider. They support a lot of weight, so absolutely. I feel like you're taking a line from Clint Eastwood from one of his Western movies. Yep. The armadillo. Really? You do? Okay. Yeah, now you're right. Mules, Orion, are far more capable than a lot of people realise. Now, the only reason I didn't put it there is I kind of classified it under horse and riding a riding horse. I kind of feel like it's a legitimate option. They are stubborn, you're right, and they are smarter, but yes, absolutely. Unrealistic mounts are commonly desired. I think that's because we're playing fantasy. And I don't have a problem with fantasy and unrealistic mounts, but I know a lot of people who are dungeon mastering are trying to sort of, particularly at low levels, when you're more inclined to try to include the things that make sense. And then later on, as your world opens up, then you're like, now you can ride a Pegasus, flying horse or something like that. Or you get on a griffin, or you're going to ride a T-Rex or something like that. We go a bit more bat crazy. I really wanted this to be sort of the entry point for mounts rather than the definitive for all mounts. This is the entry point. Yeah. So Fred, I totally get it. It is very much demanded, and it's popular. Certain cartoon characters. What I think players need to understand is you need to be very gentle with a dungeon master with regard to mounts. It's really unfair to be pushy about that sort of thing because you're not the one doing all the work, frankly. And until you've been in that position and you know what it's like, a bit of understanding. I've always been of the attitude the best games are when players make their dungeon master's job as easy as possible so that the dungeon master is able to make the game the best game they can with the skills they have at their disposal and the time they have at their disposal. Do you know what I mean? Pale Rider, Halfling Sheriff from Dragon Magazine. Number something? I'm not sure what that's all about. Orion, mounts should be standard after level 4. No, I think mounts should be available when the dungeon master sees that they can manage it. I'm always of the opinion that, all the things that I talked about in the first part of the presentation, the things that you could probably get access to fairly early on, provided you got the money and the resources. What do you got here, Kelly? Yeah, Kelly, it makes sense to have mostly horses as mounts in your game. But, in the right environment, like a desert environment, a camel makes a lot of sense too, and in the right environment, so does an elephant. An elephant's actually quite a cool mount to have, just because almost the entire party can sit on one elephant if they wanted to, and the elephant wouldn't mind too much. You might have to stop and rest a bit more often, but other than that, you should be fine. Skeleton horses, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Kelly, of course you could use any. We just talked about dragons, so Jabberwocky could certainly be a mount. Yeah. Anything in a fantasy world where you don't worry about it being realistic can certainly be a mount. It's not like a problem. Heck, you could make a giant space hamster a mount because it's a fantasy creature, right? It might be based partly on a real animal, but there's no such thing as a giant space hamster. It's a fantasy creature. Yeah, wagons and sleds. There is information in the player's handbook on wagons and sleds, so yeah, absolutely use them for sure. Where am I? Am I getting lost in the chat? Either that or I'm moving too slow. An alligator. All right, of course. Look, what would be the point in riding an alligator? How far off the ground would it be? And how are you going to ride this thing? You have to tuck your legs behind you. Like the alligator would have to be a pretty big alligator if you're going to have your legs dangling. But it's fantasy creatures, right? You can't wait for the fantasy mount video live stream. There's more than one. I will have to do about, I think, at least 2. And that's not counting the dinosaurs. So, yeah, Daniel White, riding dinosaurs is just that new giant unearthed arcana subclass. Too bad they just made it a weird punching bag. It hits like a level 1 fighter. So, can we just have a little talk about this? Like, you don't need to have a subclass to ride a dinosaur. Okay, Wizards of the Coast wants you to believe that you need to buy some book with a subclass that allows you to ride a dinosaur for Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League. But in your own games, who gives a shit? Seriously, I get annoyed when I see all these subclasses. I don't care whether they're Unearthed Arcana or official Wizards of the Coast nonsense. You do not need to have a rule to have stuff in your game. You just do it. You just do it. That's it. It's very, very simple. You don't have to go to all of this. Yeah. So this is not a go at you, Daniel, by the way. This is just that please don't buy into Wizards of the Coast nonsense. You could have included these things in the game early on. Now, you might be thinking, well, no, I can't because my Dungeon Master won't allow it. But look, even if Wizards of the Coast makes an official subclass that can ride a dinosaur, the Dungeon Master can still say, no, I don't want people riding dinosaurs in my game, and exclude it. The only time they can't is Adventurers League. So you're in no worse spot than you were before. Do you know what I mean? So, so I want to ride a dinosaur, but there's no subclass. Can we do that? Yes, no. Like, you don't need to have subclasses. You really don't. Pseudo dragon enlarged and halfling reduced. Yeah, sure. Mountain goats. Well, yeah, okay. Hello, Spirit Wolf. How's it going? Janjvik. Hello. How are you? Water mounts make sense. That's the other one. There were 3. Sorry. Fantasy creatures, flying mounts, and water mounts. And then the dinosaurs. That's 4 blooming videos on mounts. I don't know when they're happening. Don't expect them all tomorrow. It doesn't work that way for me. Hello, Pale Rider. What do you got here? Isle of Dread had the cat people attuned and riding saber-toothed tigers. Just saying. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying in reality, you can't do it. Okay? And you're showing the ass symbol to me again. Thank you very much. I'm not saying you can't do it, but realistically, it doesn't work. So if you want to include it and you're not worried about realism, then don't worry about it and just do it. What do you got here, Joe? A giant ant would work, but you would need to have some kind of mind control over it. Yeah, ants are very aggressive. It would just kill you. Yeah, you have to, but certainly strong enough to bear you. Their physiology is a bit weird, so putting a saddle on an ant might be a bit difficult. Might require a bit of ingenuity. Same thing with the spider. Putting a saddle on a spider is quite difficult, just because of where the legs are. There's so many of them. Kelly, got to go catch you later. Not a problem. See you later, Kelly. Fred, what do you got here? If the PCs can't find it and pay for it, they can buy the mount properly trained. They might afford riding horses at level 1. Yeah, it's possible at level 1. Look, it depends on how much money they have, really. Do you know what I mean? That's always the case. You need a short from me saying who gives a shit. You shouldn't say that to me, Orion. You know I would probably do it. Do you know how I feel about shorts videos as it is? And this is probably why you're saying that. Reindeer pulling your chariot. Yes, now I looked at reindeer. Riding a reindeer is a very bad idea. Okay, that's the Fred symbol. Yeah, okay. All right, I got it. Hey, before I disappear, I suppose I should tell you what's happening next week. So next week, I'm going to show you how I run online games. And I don't use a virtual tabletop. Okay? I'm going to show you. I'm not just going to explain to you. I'm actually going to show you how I do it. You will still see my face for a bit of it, but not all of it. Okay? It has been my intention for some time to do something like this, and I believe next week is the day it's going to happen. I've left it too long. For those of you who stopped playing Dungeons & Dragons, it's time to come back. And I believe that this will work for almost all of you. And I am going to try and make it as easy to understand and as easy for you to take on board. Now, after that, 2 weeks from now, after I've done the one on running online games, I don't use your virtual tabletop. Forget about it. I don't use it. There are problems with using a virtual tabletop. I'll explain anyway, but you will see. So here's what's likely to happen in 2 weeks. I will do another video, and I'll probably call it Everyone's Guide, but it might not. It might be a clever uses of some sort of spell. I am still toying whether I should do prestidigitation or druidcraft. I haven't been feeling the mojo to do those. I haven't done them. I realized I hadn't actually put the final touches on the notes, and I realized why is because it was so complicated. Can I just say that the Mage Hand clever uses spell video that I did, and the one on minor illusion, clever uses of minor illusion, was a piece of cake compared to druidcraft and prestidigitation. Prestidigitation does so much, and druidcraft is complicated and very tricky, and it's not really a spell I'm well versed with. So it's actually been very difficult. But if I don't do that, we may wind up talking about the Mage Tower. Yeah. In 2 weeks, it could be the Mage Tower, or it could be I talk about a spell, druidcraft or prestidigitation. What are those? Now, for those of you, before you all disappear, there is a Dungeon Master Roundtable today. It will be on Twitch TV. I know many of you do not like going to Twitch TV. There are 7 of us who will be talking, and I should be getting out of here because I'm supposed to be getting ready right this very minute. But as I am not ready, and as I want as many of you to come and join in the craziness that we get up to, it'll be on Dicely D&D. I will put the link into the chat right now so that you can see it. I will put something up on my community tab as well for those of you who are interested. I can tell you who will be there if you feel that that is the deciding factor in actually showing up to one of these things. So, my eyes, who will be part? This will be taking place in less than an hour. So 12 p.m. for me, which is Central Standard Time at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, it's 8 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, is it? Oh, God, I don't know which one. It's Mountain Daylight Time. It's 6 p.m. and Pacific Daylight Time. Is it now Pacific Daylight Time? 5 p.m. I think that's right. I think that's all correct. You'll have to put up with me. I'll be there. Dicely D&D, Denny, he's been great. He will be hosting the questions and the live feed, the live stream. Master of the Game, Juice, will be there. We'll have Wally DM, and we'll have D&D Homebrew, that's KR King Kevin, for those of you who know of him. And we will also have Crow's Perch. Jacob will be making his first appearance. And we are going to be talking about, I don't know what Denny was thinking, but he came up with some pretty tricky questions. So it's going to be an interesting time. I don't expect any of these questions to be very easy to answer, frankly. So thank you to everybody who hung out with me in the live feed, and I hope that everybody has a good evening. Thank you to all of my patrons. Thank you to everybody who's been watching my videos and my live streams. I do appreciate it. Thank you very much. Remember, wherever you are in the world, whether it be the morning, the afternoon, the night, or the wee early morning, please look after yourself, your family, and your friends, and be nice to your neighbours. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.